Well, I'm not going to hold you back from lunch, so this is a very light presentation. Thanks to Janelle for inviting me. She gave me an awful challenge. She said, "Oh, can you present all the projects in TMSI over the last 10 years, and after that, talk a bit about the future?" Uh, I'm going to fail miserably at that. Okay, so what I'm going to do really is just to give you an overview of some of the work that has been going on in TMSI funded by CENZAM. And after that, talk a bit more about the marine science program that is unfolding over the next 5 years. In terms of projects, so I think on behalf of all the researchers at TMSI, we would like to also thank all our collaborators in the CENZAM project. Okay, moving forward, I guess some of you who maybe you have recently come to Singapore, and I think maybe after a few months you might realize that actually this is a very strange country. There's something unusual about it. And I would say the first thing that maybe I should tell you is that actually this is the third densest country in the world. Right? The first is Macau and the second is Monaco. And you appreciate that those is quite a different scale. In Singapore, we are a very small country. There is only about 700 square kilometers, in which right now there are 5.6 million people, excluding the tourists, right? So that's a lot of people. That's about 7,000 over persons per square kilometer, which means that for every 100 meters, you should see at least 1 or 2 persons. What perhaps many of you don't realize is that actually the sea is even worse. At this moment in time, we actually have more land than sea due to reclamation. Singapore itself has actually grown by 25% of its original size. So there's about 600 square kilometers of sea, except that there are 1,000 vessels in that 600 square kilometers, which means there's really one vessel in every square kilometer. So like many of you who are actually trying to develop applications for the marine environment, I think if you've actually gone out to do field work, you would find that it's quite hazardous. There are these big speeding vessels, right? You very seriously have to care about them. So what it works out to really is that there is one vessel coming into the port of Singapore every 2 minutes. So it's a very high traffic situation. We're talking about a marine environment which is equivalent to standing in the middle of the highway. And I think that this context is very important when we do marine science. I think in Singapore, I always say this is probably the few countries in the world where one actually has a discussion about where you should go swimming. I personally wouldn't, right, because of the industries and chemicals. But it brings to you this huge challenge, high density population, and a very narrow strip of water. Think about all the anthropogenic contributions into the coastal waters around Singapore, as well as overlaying that the huge numbers of people and activity going on in a small water body. Bearing in mind that Singapore's coastal waters is very small, so geographic separation of activities is not feasible. It is the same water body going back up and down that area. Now looking maybe a bit further afield, it's also good to put things in the context of Southeast Asia. I like this map. This map comes from the Globalis program. All the little yellow dots are ships in a point in time, right? That's the shipping traffic in the South China Sea. All the big red dots are megaports coming up around Southeast Asia. And the little white dots are what we call marine protected areas. And I think one of the first things you appreciate is that really isn't any separation between the three. This is also, the South China Sea itself is also what we call the mega biodiversity hotspot in the Amazon of the marine world. So all this is overlaying each other. So when we study marine science, we have to be very aware of these issues and how they interact. I also like to bring up this map. This is a map drawn up looking at global shipping. And one of the things that ships are these huge things containing about 12 swimming pools worth of seawater, and they carry this water from one port to another. So one of the major things as for Singapore, as the world's global top transshipment hub, is that we are also an airport for organisms coming in and out. And in this year, in fact, it's been pointed out that Singapore is one of the major high-risk ports for transfer of invasive species between countries. At the same time, on the terrestrial side, due to urbanization, it already we are within the top 5 countries with invasive species present on the land side. In the marine environment, so far, the impacts have not been there, but it is a real risk. Okay, so in terms of projects, I'd like to sort of take a snapshot of at least of the past 5 years, the projects that have been funded under SENZAM. It's very broad. You see, we've had projects on environment sensing, modeling of the South China Sea, and more recently, food security has come up very much. And I think maybe this is also a very just today and yesterday, I've actually spent the whole of yesterday at the Urban Sustainability Conference, and that's where I thought that when I came to think about doing this lecture, it also made me think a lot about when we talk about marine science and urbanization, that over the last 5-10 years, certainly through the SENZAM programs, we have learned a lot about the marine environment. And going forwards, we also start to thinking about the urbanization and the impact of marine environment and urbanization. So I'm not going to describe all these projects in detail. Many of the colleagues who are participating in these projects are actually here in the audience, and I'm going to leave you to attack them for questions. Just tell me which project you want, and I'll point out the researcher. A quick snapshot. Definitely, in the earlier phases, there was a lot of work on hydrodynamic modeling, and I would say that through the SENZAM projects, we actually have now a very good snapshot of the environmental processes in the South China Sea. This is very important in the context of Singapore, because the seasons in the sea here are all monsoon-driven. And so through the SENZAM project, we have actually now a very good map of the environmental parameters that affect Singapore. Singapore is actually biologically in a very interesting point. We kind of lie between 2 oceans, and in biology, we always talk about this as being in a fulcrum between the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And actually, when I look at biology, we have always noticed that we've had a bit of both. Many of these hydrodynamic models now actually help very much to explain why you see this change in fauna in Singapore. It's just from the way that the currents pass across Singapore. And in terms of biology, again, I think my colleague Cendric has already mentioned a bit, and these high-resolution models are also very important in our understanding of simple things like how algal blooms form. In the case of dinoflagellate blooms, for example, I have learned that estuary fronts are actually a very big way. They're very important to how dinoflagellates get together in sufficient numbers to actually cause an impact. They're a bit different, maybe from diatoms, which are more dispersed. Cendric already has gone through this slide for me, so I don't really need to go through it. Other projects include my colleagues in ARL, doing very nice work. What they've been doing is making use of snapping shrimps. Just a footnote, those of you who think that the sea is a very nice, quiet place, I also like you to know, I've also discovered from my colleagues in ARL that actually our marine environment is a very, 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 very noisy one because of the industry. But at the same time, there's also this huge background noise of snapping shrimps. Apparently, they are very abundant around coastal areas, so much so that they can also be used to start mapping structures in the sea. So this work is actually quite interesting, that they can actually use snapping shrimps to image the coastal areas. More recently, there is several of my colleagues are involved in food security projects, starting with looking at flooding in different cities, now moving on to looking at rainfall in much larger scales in the South China, in the countries around the region, in relation to food security. And food security, by the way, has actually been identified as one of the key areas. I think yesterday the minister talked about Cities of Tomorrow, and one of the big anchors in that program is actually going to be the food security program. Okay, so now going forward, I would just like to, maybe for those of you who haven't really heard about the Marine Science Program, to tell you a bit more about the programs. It pretty much unfolded somewhere around 2015 when we started talking about marine science and the relevance of marine science to Singapore. The NRF since then sort of looked into it. Why is marine science important to Singapore? Most of the research in Singapore has always focused on mainland Singapore, on the idea that we have very little coastal water. But Singapore is an island state. Interestingly, we are in an area, as I mentioned, at the edge of the Coral Triangle, in which there's a very high biodiversity. And as a huge transshipment hub, you can imagine we are also transferring a lot of this biodiversity to everyone else and distributing it in not so nice ways. Climate change is a big issue. Climate change will affect the South China Sea, and most countries in the South China Sea depend hugely on the ocean resources. So it is an issue that Singapore cannot ignore. The next aspect that was brought up was that most of our neighbors do have what we call red bladder issues, and maybe in that sense, Singapore has a bit more luxury of thinking about marine science and looking at higher-end R&D research. So it has sort of a first-mover advantage. And for example, NRF brought up that there are already existing partners in Singapore with a fair bit of infrastructure through the Shenzhen program, through TMSI, through SELSI. So the R&D infrastructure is already pretty well set up for marine science. The key themes that were identified, well, after a lot of long discussions and arguments over what programs should be included and not included, I would say first off is that anything that's already funded by an existing NRF program cannot be part of the MSRGP. So we were a bit constrained, but these were the three main pillars that were identified as important. Basically, firstly, marine biodiversity. From the NRF perspective, they are sort of looking beyond monitoring, right? What's the fate of our biodiversity going forward? Climate change, for example. And I think the other maybe interesting thing for those of you technologists in the audience, one of the big questions the chief executive said to me is, so what can we do with all this biodiversity? Right, so those of you interested in biomimetics, he's looking for proposals, right? He's serious. There's all this biodiversity. Can you do something with it? The second pillar was an environmental impact assessment. We agreed that, yes, there are many monitoring programs going on, but I think the overall sense was, can we do better? We need to improve the quality of the information that we are collecting. EIA is a very big business in Singapore. Many companies come to Singapore and from here work in the regional countries. So for example, DHI, Deltares. So in that sense, any R&D to improve the way environmental impact assessments are done is very welcome. The last one, coastal engineering. Coastal protection is also another big pillar inside the Cities of Tomorrow research program that was launched yesterday. So, with climate change, storm surges, there are going to be all these big ugly walls. Can we do better? Can we integrate greenery? Can we restructure shores? So these are the three main pillars for the program, for the current 2016 to 2021 program. So where St. John's Island Marine Lab came in was simply that, well, actually in terms of infrastructure, research infrastructure, the institutes in Singapore already have a lot of equipment, a lot of expertise, a lot of technologies. And so where the Marine Lab really fits in was to provide seawater facilities for people to conduct research. Just earlier, Stefan was talking about NUS and NTU having to work together. Well, I have an even bigger challenge. The NRF would like everyone to work together, right? Including SIT, SUTD, and all the polytechnics. Because one of the big issues that came up when we started talking about marine science was that if we sat down and counted all our marine scientists, we don't actually have a lot of them in Singapore. So there was, in that sense, a great need, in order to push marine science forward in Singapore, a need for every person who is doing any marine thing to get together. Many of the problems are hugely interdisciplinary. So in that sense, one of the roles in the Marine Lab is also to try and all of you who are interested in marine-related stuff to let us know so that we put people in contact whenever there are grant calls or any interests. We know who to send out the information to. So the Marine Lab, I welcome all of you to visit, right? Just contact me or one of my staff. We have already set up the website. Very simple process. You don't have to collaborate with NUS to use it. You just need to go in, register, and you can start using the facilities. Why are we in St. John's Island? Why can't we be more conveniently located? It's very simple. That's about the only place we can find with fairly decent seawater, right? It's facing the strong currents in the Singapore Straits, so at least there's a reasonable, good quality water. The other big thing that maybe some of you may not appreciate is actually the Sisters Island Marine Park. As I mentioned, Singapore has been reclaiming land and a lot of reclamation, a lot of urban development. And one of the major consequences of that is that it has prevented a lot of long-term monitoring. If you speak to my colleagues, they will tell you that when you start out your project in a location A, it may not exist by the time your project finished. Some works or something would have come and changed it. So doing long-term monitoring has always been a challenge. The Marine Park was set up in 2014, and that actually now presents a huge opportunity for people who are interested in longer-term monitoring to set up systems there. At least it gives us all a stable point in the marine environment of Singapore to use for research. Right now, I think this is a short list of the projects in the first round of the Marine Science R&D program. It's quite broad, a lot of emphasis on climate change. The second round will be results will be released in July, right? So if you go to the MSRDP website, you will be able to, you'll find out what the next tranche of projects are. For those who may not have been shortlisted, the good news is they are also launching a huge slew of internship programs. So inspire your students to take up a project that benefits you, right? They are going to be given grants, student grants to do projects here as well as going overseas. Also, for those of you who are graduating, I think they've only barely finished recruitment for round one. So with the launch of a new, I think there are 12 projects in the second round. There are definitely a lot of positions for RFs and research assistants. So definitely keep an eye out if you're looking for a job. And with that, I would like to end maybe with something that Professor Chow Lok Meng always said. In Singapore, we always think that there's nothing left to do. I mean, there can't be any biodiversity left in the sea to care about. And like Prof. Chow said, the corals are still spawning every year, and they adapt. So it's ours to try and do what we can to protect and conserve the marine environment. Thank you.